Okay, that camera is on. And just to get things going, my name is Mike Dekema, and today is November 6, 2013. And tell me your name.
My name is James Everett Boatman. I was known as Sonny when I was growing up. And then when I went away to college, I became Jim. And when I came back about 20 years ago to Corinth, all I could get of my youth was my childhood name. So I took it. So here I'm known as Sonny, an old man with a little boy's name.
And you were born, tell me about your family.
Well, I was born in 1930. You want to know where my family came from?
Absolutely.
My family lived in Raymer, Tennessee. The Boatmans and the Johnsons lived in that area around Raymer and Sulphur Springs and all in that area. And about 1925, they seem to have migrated to Corinth. My grandfather, Brant Johnson, whom we called Opaw, and my grandmother, Arilla Johnson, whom we called Oma. And I didn't know until in recent times that those are names that people called their grandparents in Germany. And we weren't German, so I don't know how that came to be. But anyway, they moved here, and my grandfather, who was a cattle trader, he traded mules and cattle and horses and farm machinery and anything that he could make money on. And he had a farm out in West Corinth where his wife milked all those cows. Sometimes there would be a whole bunch of cattle. He had had an accident early in his life that caused him to have 2 fingers missing. And so he never learned to milk a cow, or if he did, he didn't milk those cows. He just brought them in. And my grandmother, who was like a pioneer lady, she was a tall, thin woman with big, strong hands, and very strong disciplinarian. She didn't want anybody crying. Mm-hmm. They had to dry it up and stop snubbing or being whiny. And she was quite a wonderful lady, and so was my grandfather. My grandfather and grandmother Boatman moved here when the Johnsons did, but didn't stay that long. I guess about the time I went to school at 6 years old, they had moved to Middleton, Tennessee, to be near my father's sister, Cecil Brant. And growing up, I would go visit them in the summer, and to let you know how gentle things were, they would put me on the train in Corinth, and they would meet me on the train in Middleton. And as a 8-year-old, 9-year-old, 10-year-old person, I was sent on this journey, and by myself, and that was just fine. Anyway, back to Corinth. My grandfather's sons all had that trading instinct, and they became automobile dealers. My uncle R.C. Johnson became a Nash dealer, and this is after the war, when new cars came back. My uncle Price Johnson was a Cadillac Oldsmobile dealer, and they had businesses on Highway 72 across the street from each other, each sort of competing for who had the best building or whatever. It was a peaceful competition. My third uncle, Uncle Prentice Johnson, worked sometime for one of them and sometime for the other. He didn't have his own business, but he also was in the used car business. And his 2 sons, Bud and Max, became used car dealers. Uncle R.C.'s son, Buddy Johnson, R.C. Jr., became a used car dealer. And Uncle Price's sons became Oldsmobile catalytic dealers, and he was also into real estate. So they were in real estate as well as automobiles. My father, when he first got here, had his own butcher shop that we had a photograph of. And in that photograph, his partner was Lee Milstead, who was someone who had moved to Corinth from Raymer, and they were old-time friends. And Lee Milstead is the grandfather of Donald Blassingame, who is famous in these parts because he was a Corinth high school graduate who went away and became a St. Louis Cardinal, and then had a long career in baseball. He and, well, anyway, so my father had that butcher shop from about 1925 to 1930. And apparently he had let his customers have meat on credit, and in 1929, when the bottom fell out, nobody could pay back for their bills, and he went out of business. So he then worked for a grocery store for Roy Rhodes, who was a well-known man around town, who had a grocery store, and he had the butcher department in the back of that store. And then after that, for Bulmer Fowler. And both of those stores were on Wick Street, the street that's now being rebirthed downtown, that had long since caved in, but now is coming back. My father in 1929 was elected Justice of the Peace of the First District. And shortly after that, when my Uncle Price built a farm out east of town, built a new house on a farm east of town, where Roscoe Turner Airport had been. Roscoe Turner, by the way, is another one of our famous Corinthians who was a famous aviator who became not only nationally famous but world famous. And somebody else will tell you all about him. Mm-hmm. The airport was named for Roscoe Turner, but when the airport was moving and my uncle bought the farm, it is the farm that is now Shiloh Falls housing development and golf course. And the place where they have the restaurant was located where my uncle's big barn was when it was his farm. He was big into real estate and he loved that farm, so I don't know how he would feel about what's happened to it. He probably would have thought it was fine, that it was cut up and made into nice housing lots and so forth. My father, back to him, was a Justice of the Peace for 3 4-year terms, and then he and while he was Justice of the Peace during the Second World War period, people came from miles around, from St. Louis, Chicago, and places, distant places, to get married in Corinth, because every place north of Corinth, you had to have a week or 4-day waiting period after a blood test before you could get married. And people who had a short time home on leave and wanted to get married before they went overseas didn't have that time, the luxury of that time to wait, so they came to Corinth. Many people were married in the courthouse here, and I can remember when the courthouse would close, my father would sometimes meet people across the street just east of the courthouse at the Waldron Hotel, where they would come, and he could write their, he could handle the marriage license and marry them there. But if they came after that hour, they could come to our house, and they came to our house anytime, day or night. And sometimes he would be up in his robe and pajamas marrying people at 3 in the morning, and I might be in my pajamas sort of peering out to see what's happening. When I was in high school, sometimes I would sit in the Waldron Hotel lobby and do my homework while he was away handling another customer or something. At that point, as Justice of the Peace, not only did he marry people, but he tried cases. And people would come if their husband had too much to drink and gave them a problem. The wives would come and have them put in jail under a peace bond on Saturday night, and then by Sunday they're coming to get them out and so forth. This was a period when Corinth was known as Little Chicago because of the state line. And Louise Hathcock, who was famous at the state line, would, if Jack was unruly and beat her up or something, she would come and put him under a peace bond with my father, and came to our house to do that. And then Sunday or Monday she would come and get him out. So he was, in that book called The State Line Mob, he's mentioned, my father's mentioned, several times. At least one of the times they've misspelled his name, but anyway, he was a part of all of that happening. And I started to say, when my uncle moved to his house where Roscoe Turner Airport had been, my father bought my uncle's house at the corner of Douglas and Shiloh Road, where my niece, Luann Parrish, now lives. And across the street from us were houses, but behind those houses were pastures. And you know that old saying, you can take the man out of the country, but you can't get the country out of the man. We weren't ready to give up our cow that we had in West Corinth, so my father made the garage in the back into a stable, and we fenced in the backyard so we could bring my chickens, and we had chickens and cows in town, and I don't think it was illegal, nobody complained, but I took the cow across Shiloh Road every day to the pasture behind the houses, and at night I would bring her back. And it was quite a Shiloh Road, which is a very heavily trafficked road now, was not so heavily trafficked in those days, so I wasn't really in danger of going across this road. It was paved, but I do remember that mules pulling wagons loaded with hay and other things would pass periodically along between cars passing. So still horse and wagons were still happening.
And cows.
And cows. And directly across the street from us was a big house that's now been torn down, where the Presbyterian Church has built a youth house. And behind where the youth house is was a big barn. And the Smiths who lived there had cows and pigs and horses. And so it was really like across the street from country. And all of the area now that are fancy houses in the neighborhood were places that my dog Mac and I used to go and walk in the country just to be alone. Mm-hmm. Where the Presbyterian Church currently is, there was located an establishment called the Alamo. The Alamo looked like a service station, but the outline of the building front was reminiscent of the Alamo. And it was a stucco building, and it had different tenants, but at one point it was a beer joint. And when it was a beer joint, it had tourist cabins in the back, and the tourist cabins had garages with garage doors. So if any local businessmen visited during the day, their car was not able to be seen. It was through the yard of that establishment that I went with my cow to the gate, where I put her in the pasture in the back. So it was really interesting. Then later on, other people had that business, and it was not having any illegal happenings. Eventually a family lived in those buildings and ran a little grocery store in the front. But I do remember at some point they had slot machines in the front. I don't know if they were legal or not, but as kids we went in and out of the front part. Let's see. Questions?
You ultimately, obviously, went off to college.
I did.
Where did you go?
I went to the Memphis Academy of Arts, which is now called the Memphis College of Art, in Memphis, Tennessee. I studied at their location when they were housed in two Victorian mansions, and in between the two mansions was the two carriage houses that had been joined together for part of our school activities. And these two mansions and the carriage house and the grounds around them were surrounded by other Victorian houses that were down in their luck. They became boarding houses and rooming houses, and urban renewal came through and wiped out most of them. So now what's left are the old houses that the school was housed in, and a few houses across the street, and two houses west of the school, and that's called Victorian Village, when the whole place used to be a Victorian village. Had it not been wiped out by that big urban renewal project, I feel sure by this time those houses would have been regentrified, and young people, as in Brooklyn, where I eventually lived, in a brownstone area, young people would have come there and repaired those houses, and it would have been something else. But then you can't turn back history.
Where did your artistic bent come from?
Well, I studied art and interior design at the Art Academy, and I was there only 1 year before the Korean War was threatening, and I was about to be drafted into the Army, and my brother had been in the Air Force, and so I decided if I was going in, I wanted to be in the Air Force. And I had completed 1 year and a few months at the Art Academy, and a friend of mine and I from Corinth, who shared an apartment with me, were working with friends of ours, also from Corinth, who had a decorating shop, and we were the labor. We refinished furniture and hauled furniture, and I helped with decorating plans and so forth. And for a joke, we told our two friends that we had joined the Air Force, and they gave us a big going away party. So we were so embarrassed we joined the Air Force. But we went to Wichita Falls for basic training, and then later on to. Are we running out of time?
No, he was telling me.
He's sniffling. He's sniffling, and the microphones are very sensitive.
Oh, okay. After basic training, my good friend Jack Young went on to someplace out west, and I was sent to Selma, Alabama, which at that point was not unlike Corinth. It was a little town and a friendly town, and I enjoyed my Air Force time there. I was there just a few months before being sent overseas, and I was sent to Tokyo, Japan, and I was 2.5 years in Tokyo, which I really enjoyed, and became good friends with a number of Japanese people. One whose name was Kazuo Mizumura came to this country. She had been my art teacher there, teaching me sumi drawing, and she had corresponded with my sister Nelda Parrish. Anyway, when Kazuo, whose nickname was Bay Mizumura, moved to New York to college, she came to Corinth and visited my family. And one Christmas, and she came, we took her to church with us, and she wore full kimono to church, and that just about amazed everybody. They couldn't see the preacher for turning around to look. Anyway, she went on to live in New York, and was one of the reasons I later on moved to New York.
And you had a long career in New York.
I had a long career in New York. After the Art Academy, I decided to go to Mexico to school for 1 year because I had the GI Bill, and it would send me money and so forth. So, and my trip, my stay in Japan had made me curious to know other cultures. So I did go to Mexico for a year, which I enjoyed very much. And after 9 months there, I came back to Memphis and worked for a time in department stores, Lowenstein's department store in Memphis, and then for a woman, Peggy Leopard, in a design firm. And one of our clients was Holiday Inn, which we did some work for a time, and Malco Theaters, who also owned bowling alleys, and we decorated their bowling alleys. You wonder what you can do to a bowling alley, but we did whatever you could. And anyway, I went to New York and visited a friend who had moved there, and came back determined that I would move to New York, and did. I moved there with the promise of a job interview, not the promise of a job, the promise of an interview at Lord and Taylor on Fifth Avenue, and that promise was enough. And I was by this time 28 or 29, and so I thought it's now or never, and I interviewed for a job at Lord and Taylor, and I thought that they should start me at a more advanced station instead of a decorator helper, since I'd had experience in Memphis at the Lowensteins there. So I didn't take that job until I looked around for a while, and then when nothing else showed up, I called and said, "Is that job still available?" And so I took it for a temporary job because I wanted to really to work for some well-known decorator and apprentice them. But it turned out that that temporary job lasted 15, 16 years, and from a decorator's helper, I was eventually advanced to being in charge of the decorating department. This was not decorating homes, this was decorating the interior of the store. Like the window display displays windows, we displayed separately the interior of the store. And we had 20 people working in the display department, and 2 carpenters assigned to us and 1 painter. They had a whole paint department, and 1 porter. So we were a pretty big department at that store.
So you were living in Brooklyn at the time?
I lived, my first apartment was in the Village,
okay,
on MacDougall Street. And a friend of mine from Memphis had lived in New York, and he called a woman friend of his there, and I sublet her apartment sight unseen, and it was 1 block, 2 blocks south of Washington Square on MacDougall Street. And I lived there for, it was a cold water flat, so it had been converted to hot water, but I had a bathtub in the kitchen, but it was covered by a countertop, which was my kitchen countertop, and then just inside the next little section, there was an interior bathroom. Originally, everybody on 1 floor would share, 4 apartments shared 1 bathroom in the hallway, but I was lucky that the back apartments now had inside bathrooms. I was there a few years before moving to a few blocks away on Charles and Bleecker, where I had a somewhat bigger apartment and a better way of life, a little more room to live in. And I was still working at Lord & Taylor, but I decided to open an art gallery in a space across the street from where I lived. And it was open only at night and on weekends, and it's called Boatman Gallery. And I had it for a couple of years, showing artwork of my friends from Memphis that I had known, some of the instructors and some of the fellow students showed their artwork there. And then when I was advanced at Lord & Taylor to a more energy and time-consuming job, I had to sell the gallery, give up the gallery. And the reason I tell that long story is because years later I came to Corinth and opened a gallery which subsequently closed, and now I'm involved with a nonprofit gallery.
Sure. So how does a guy living kind of a glamorous New York art gallery life feel about his origins in Corinth at that particular time?
Well, my little gallery in the Village was not very glamorous. It was on Bleecker Street, and although Bleecker Street has become more glamorous now, it had affordable rents in those days, and it was mostly, Bleecker Street was mostly antique shops, restaurants, and a few galleries. And since most of the business that happened in the Village happened after dark, it was okay that I could just keep it open at night. And while I was there, it turned out that if I wanted to go to dinner with friends or to a movie, I needed to get somebody to gallery sit for me. And there were some girls that I knew from Lord & Taylor and some other artists from the area and other friends who would gallery sit for me and give me a little break. And one of the artists who showed his work there was a friend of Frank Serpico, who later became famous. And Frank, whom we called Paco, used to visit the gallery a lot, and it turned out that Paco and I were born on April 14th, both of us, just different years, and we became really good friends. But it seemed that I furnished him all these girlfriends, because he dated a number of these girls that were, well, out of the, I guess he dated 3 out of the 5 they used to gallery sit. And the day that he was shot, one of the girls who worked at, was my secretary at Lord & Taylor, didn't come in that day, and she called and said, oh, Paco has been shot, and she was at the hospital. And while she was at the hospital, she met an airline stewardess and several other girlfriends that Paco had. He was quite a ladies' man. And as you probably have seen that movie, Serpico, after he went to other countries and everything, leaving New York, he finally came back, and I had been out of touch with him all of these years. But recently a friend of mine found where he was on the internet, and he lives upstate New York, above Hudson, New York, where I used to go on weekends to Hudson, New York when I lived in New York City. And I got his phone number, and I called and left a message, and a few months later he called me back. He had been away on vacation, and we had a couple of hours brushing up on old times.
Excellent.
And it was an interesting conversation.
And then you came back to Corinth.
Well, and then I came back to Corinth. As I often say, when I was 19, I couldn't wait to get away. And when I was 65, or about to be 64, or whatever it was, I couldn't wait to get back. So I came back to Corinth and bought a little building downtown where I opened, actually I called it Boatman Gallery, but it was really a gift shop. It was on Fillmore Street, across the street from Waits. And I went back to New York and got lots of merchandise and things for it, and was very excited about it. And it was very busy during Christmas, and then after that it wasn't moving very fast, and I had an offer. Somebody wanted to buy the building from me for what I had put into it, and I put into it as much as the building cost, and so they bought that building, and I gave up on that art gallery. And anyway, so since that time, I have done, since I've been back here, I have done decorating for Commerce National Bank. When they moved to their current location, I devised the division of the offices and the front, and the artwork and the coloring and the carpet and all that, designed the interior. And then for Kitty Reed, who is from the Reed family and Reed's department store in Tupelo, she was downsizing from a big house with a pool and tennis court to another big house, but I had to help her decide what to use from her other house when moving to this house. And then I did an apartment or co-op at Pickwick for a local drugstore owner. And then beyond that, mostly what I've done has been volunteer work. I got involved with with preservation when I first got back here, and was on the Preservation Commission for several terms, and was at one point their president. And then I worked, I was a volunteer at the Veranda Curley House, on the board there for a number of years, and until that board was dissolved. And
if someone on Bleecker Street had asked you why you were moving back to Mississippi, what would you have told them?
Goodness, I don't know. I had enjoyed all the excitement of living in New York and living in the village, and then subsequently moving to Brooklyn, which I skipped in all of this. I'd enjoyed all of that a great deal, but I was ready for a smaller town where a traffic jam here is 5 cars stacked up at a traffic light, and in New York it was a mile on the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway of automobiles that couldn't move. My neighborhood in Brooklyn was wonderful, a wonderful brownstone neighborhood, but you could be mugged if you were walking from the subway to your house at night. And as I got older, I felt like I looked like a target more than I had when I was younger. And even though I hated to leave my brownstone in Brooklyn, which I'd come to love, it had increased in value, which was good, and I was able to sell it for enough to pay for my move back to Corinth and to buy a house in Corinth. And
for a person with artistic interests, an artful person, is Mississippi a good place to live?
Pardon?
Do you think Mississippi is a good place to live for an artful?
Oh, well, when you think of all of the writers from Mississippi who have made it big internationally, and well, I think that and Eudora Welty, who was a writer, but she was also a photographer during the Depression, and did some very artful photographs that appear in galleries and in books. And Memphis, which is very close by, I felt was always an easy distance that I could make. Mm-hmm. So I don't know, it just became right. I first thought that I wanted to move back to Memphis, and then I decided I'd always thought I would live about 10 years in Memphis and then move back to Corinth, but I realized I had spent those 10 extra years already in Brooklyn, and it was time to move directly to Corinth.
So you can go home again?
You can go home again.
That's wonderful. You know, I think we've covered your life.
Well, thank you.
It is.
I've enjoyed talking with you. There's lots of other stories, and I've given you the names of people
yes, we really appreciate
who can tell you those stories. And I appreciate your asking me to be a part of this.
Well, thank you. I'm going to turn the camera off. Again, we've done this with your permission. Is that right?
That's right.
Thank you. I'm going to turn it off.